The penthouse apartment on Chicago's Magnificent Mile shimmered, a perfect backdrop for the annual charity gala, masking the quiet decay in the lives of the city's elite. Daniel raised a glass to his wife, Elena, their smiles rehearsed, yet his gaze lingered not on her perfect satin dress, but on the cryptic text message lighting up his phone screen in the pocket of his tux. He was here tonight to finalize a deal, not for his finance firm, but for the soul of his marriage, and the woman currently walking through the ballroom doors, radiating quiet resolve, was his collateral. If the tremor of secrets, betrayal, and the painful price of fair treated in modern love touches a nerve, stay here, and let's unravel what happens when the perfect life cracks open. The 27th floor of the Chicago Federal Reserve was a sanctuary of polished marble and hushed ambition, the sort of place Daniel Hayes felt most honest. It was here, not in the $4.5 million penthouse apartment he shared with his wife, Elena, that he allowed himself to admit his life was a sequence of meticulously managed assets. Even his marriage was structured like a favorable merger. 2 ambitious careers, a socially impeccable child, and a mutual understanding that appearance was the currency of their world. Tonight, the apartment was flawless, a testament to Elena's design sensibilities and her iron-willed control over their domestic optics. The scent of French truffles and Chilean sea bass mingled with the clean, sharp aroma of ambition. They were hosting 24 of the city's most influential power players: a federal judge, the president of a major university, and the requisite handful of investment bankers who lubricated the entire ecosystem. Daniel watched Elena from across the vast, panoramic living room, a space that overlooked the nocturnal glitter of the Gold Coast. She was draped in a sleek, emerald velvet dress that matched the intensity in her eyes. She laughed a little too brightly at the judge's dull anecdote, her hand resting a little too casually on the arm of a major client. She was performing the role of Daniel Hayes' successful, loving wife with practiced grace. But Daniel no longer saw the woman he married. He saw an actress, and the audience was the city of Chicago. He excused himself to their home office, a dark, temperature-controlled space designed for late-night deal-making. He wasn't looking for a document. He was looking for confirmation. He sat behind his custom walnut desk, the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him. He opened Elena's work iPad, which she often left unlocked, presuming his lack of interest in her minor affairs. Daniel had long suspected the existence of Nora Sullivan, the celebrated architect whose firm had recently won a high-profile city contract Daniel had coveted. The suspicion was a cold, constant pressure, not a sudden stab of jealousy. He navigated to a little-used messaging app, buried deep in a folder labeled Vendor Invoices. The stream of texts was short, intimate, and devastating in its banal certainty. Mark, are you wearing the emerald tonight? It makes me forget all my deadlines. Elena, just for you, Daniel is preoccupied. The usual performance. Mark, I need more than a performance, Elena. Soon. There was no fevered declaration of love, no grand, agonizing soliloquy. Just a few lines confirming that the entire structure of Daniel's life was an ongoing, casual lie. The betrayal felt less like a passion crime and more like a hostile takeover. Daniel closed his eyes, leaning back against the leather. The noise of the party, the clinking of crystal, the polite, high-pitched laughter was muffled by the soundproofing, making the office feel like the bottom of a silent, glass-bottomed ocean. He wasn't devastated. He was nullified. The problem wasn't the broken marriage. The problem was the inevitable scandal, the public humiliation, the social cost, and the inevitable brutal custody fight for Ethan. He thought of Nora Sullivan's wife, Nora. He'd met her on several occasions at similar functions. She ran a highly visible, respectable foundation. She was quiet, intelligent, and carried herself with an air of dignified resilience. A woman who understood the gravity of public perception. A cold, precise plan began to form in Daniel's mind, a strategy so detached and ruthless it could only have been born in a crisis of the heart. He would not engage in shouting or tears. He would not give Elena the dignity of an emotional defense. He would not allow the affair to be a private, dirty secret. He would treat it like a business transaction, an unfavorable position to be exited with maximum damage to the opposition. He opened his personal phone, his fingers steady, and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Nora Sullivan. The party was still in full swing. He had an hour before he had to rejoin the performance. The thought of contacting his wife's lover's wife, his silent, unwilling partner in destruction, did not bring him pleasure, but a chilling sense of absolute control. The night was still young, but the foundation of two high-profile Chicago marriages had just begun to crack, and Daniel Hayes was already calculating the final settlement. He sent a single crisp text message. "We need to talk, now, about your husband and my wife." He returned the iPad to its charging station, straightened his tie, and stepped back into the dazzling light of the party. He smiled, a genuine, if brittle, smile this time. Elena caught his eye and flashed a quick, approving nod, oblivious to the fact that the contract of their life had just been voided and the penalty for breach was about to be served in public. "How are things, darling?" she murmured, gliding up to him with a fresh glass of champagne. "Perfect," Daniel replied, the lie tasting like ashes. "Absolutely perfect. The evening is going exactly as planned."
The morning after the dinner party carried the peculiar emptiness of a house already sold. Elena had left early for a showing in the suburbs, her movements crisp and efficient, devoid of any unusual warmth or distance. The sheer banality of their routine was the most profound insult. Their life was so well-oiled that even betrayal ran on schedule. Daniel arrived at the designated cafe, a minimalist spot tucked into a corner of the financial district, chosen for its anonymity and its clientele. The type of people who understood discretion was profitable. He took a corner table, shielded by an imposing glass art installation that refracted the weak morning light. He arrived 15 minutes early, giving himself time to compose the script of the encounter. This was not a plea for sympathy, but a hostile takeover proposal. Nora Sullivan arrived precisely at the agreed-upon time. She wasn't dressed for a clandestine meeting. She wore a dove-gray suit of impeccable tailoring, a uniform of professional respectability that underscored her role as the director of the city's leading arts foundation. She carried a leather portfolio, suggesting she had simply stepped away from a board meeting. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that settled in the muscles around the eyes rather than the skin. There was no visible anger, only a chilling intellectual restraint. "Mr. Hayes," she acknowledged, her voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Thank you for being so cryptic. I canceled a meeting with a major donor. This needs to be worth the inconvenience." "It will be," Daniel said, foregoing small talk. He slid his phone across the table. He had preloaded the screen with the three most damning pieces of evidence: the text exchange from Elena's iPad, a time-stamped photo of Mark and Elena entering a boutique hotel near O'Hare from a private investigator he'd hired weeks ago, and a copy of his divorce lawyer's retention agreement. Nora didn't reach for the phone immediately. She looked at Daniel, her gaze assessing the man who had just blown up the privacy of her grief. "I believe you, Mr. Hayes, but tell me why you needed me to see this in person." "Because we're talking about more than divorce," Daniel stated. "We're talking about reputation. You and I, Mrs. Sullivan, we're assets in this city. Mark and Elena are risks. If we let them manage the exit, they control the narrative. They minimize their financial and social cost, and we become the collateral damage, the scorned spouses who failed to maintain their marriages." Nora finally picked up the phone. She scrolled through the images quickly, clinically, her expression remaining perfectly blank. The most telling detail was not the photo, but the slight, involuntary clench of her jaw when she read the familiar, careless intimacy of her husband's texts. She put the phone down, pushing it back toward Daniel. "What is the trade, Daniel? Because I don't believe you called me here to commiserate." "No, I called you here to partner." He corrected. The city is expecting an event announcement from your foundation. We leverage it. The annual Arts Gala is next month. We arrive together, unannounced. A public, joint statement that renders their denials irrelevant and gives us, the victims, the authority over the narrative. They wanted a public affair. We give them a public consequence. The cafe noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle, high-pitched hum of money being made seemed to recede. Nora looked out at the street, watching the hurried procession of lawyers and consultants with briefcases, the faceless army of the loop. "You're proposing a spectacle," Nora whispered, the accusation laced with reluctant understanding, "an act of calculated humiliation. It's unprofessional, unethical, and deeply cruel." "It is," Daniel agreed, leaning forward, "and it's the only language they speak. Their currency is social standing. We bankrupt them. Think of your foundation, Nora. If Mark is exposed first, your reputation is tarnished by association. If we expose them jointly, strategically, we appear as the wronged, proactive party, strong, decisive, and refusing to be defined by their shame. We protect our legacies." This was the crux of the dilemma. Nora's foundation had just secured a massive government grant, contingent on the exemplary moral conduct of its leadership. Mark's infidelity, if revealed naturally, would be a catastrophic blow. Daniel had targeted her fear of professional failure, a fear that rivaled her hurt. Nora slowly stirred the cold foam of her untouched latte. "And what happens after the gala, Daniel? We've achieved maximum damage. Then what? Do we become a new item? The Rebound Alliance? A second-act scandal built on the ashes of the first?" "No," Daniel replied, meeting her steady gaze. "We become partners in mutual dissolution. We exit our marriages cleanly, with all the necessary leverage for assets and, most importantly, for my son. We separate the day after. Our alliance is strictly transactional, Nora. We are two forces enacting a necessary surgical destruction, nothing more." A long, heavy silence settled between them, a silence full of shattered vows and nascent, dangerous strategies. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a harsh, unblinking light on the glass installation, scattering sharp, fractured colors across the table. Nora did not look away. She saw the ruthlessness in Daniel's eyes, but she also recognized the deep, cold loneliness that mirrored her own. She was looking at a man who had already lost his marriage and was now simply trading the pieces. "You're an awful man, Daniel Hayes," she said, her voice barely a breath. "I am a pragmatic one," he corrected. "The choice is simple, Nora. We manage the fire or we burn in it. Which is it?" She finally nodded, a minuscule movement of her head that carried the weight of a monumental decision. "Fine, the gala. But you handle the press and I handle the narrative to my board. And if you dare compromise my son's well-being in your divorce, this alliance is terminated violently." "Agreed," Daniel said, extending his hand. The handshake was firm, professional, and entirely sterile. It was the closing of a deal, not the beginning of a partnership. They had just sealed their revenge, and in the process, they had entered a territory more fraught with danger than their failing marriages ever were.
The weeks that followed the meeting with Nora were a study in psychological warfare waged in the silence of their Chicago penthouse. The apartment, once a symbol of their success, became a stage. Daniel and Elena were expert players, gliding through their shared life with an unnerving smoothness. They held hands at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, exchanged polite, rehearsed banter at the firm's quarterly dinner, and coordinated drop-offs for Ethan at his Montessori school. Every gesture was a lie, every glance a scrutiny. Daniel found himself observing Elena with a clinical detachment that both sickened and emboldened him. He noted the way her eyes lingered on her phone in the elevator, the way she canceled meetings with a vague, hurried explanation, and the careful precision with which she avoided mentioning Nora Sullivan, a name that was now a toxic phantom in their home. Her calmness was not innocence. It was the composure of a person convinced she was managing her secret flawlessly. The pressure cooker was internal. Daniel felt the cold, creeping weight of his own calculated cruelty. His days were spent finalizing the biggest M&A deals of his career, leveraging billions for clients. His nights were spent leveraging the truth for himself. He had compartmentalized his life so completely that the ruthless lawyer and the betrayed husband were indistinguishable. His only unscheduled rendezvous was with Nora. They met twice more, ostensibly to coordinate the precise moment of their joint arrival at the gala, but the meetings became unexpected exercises in emotional honesty. At a high-rise gym they both frequented, speaking quietly over the rhythmic thud of treadmills, Nora articulated the pain Daniel refused to acknowledge. "I hate what you're making me do, Daniel," Nora had said, her voice strained by exertion and emotional fatigue. "This isn't about justice. This is about being the first to break the vase, not the first to pick up the pieces." "We're not breaking the vase, Nora," Daniel countered, his breath even. "We're exposing that it was already cracked and they were hiding the fault lines with gold leaf. This secures your foundation. It secures my son." His son, Ethan. Daniel used Ethan as his shield and his hammer. Every time the gnawing guilt of his plan threatened to surface, Daniel would watch the 5-year-old playing on the living room rug, building block towers that mirrored the fragile height of their apartment. "This is for Ethan," he would repeat, "to ensure the custody battle is short, clean, and favors stability. Not for revenge." Yet the more he asserted this, the more the lie felt like the only stability he was fighting for. One evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen island scrolling through photos of a charity trip Mark and Nora had taken to Central America the previous year. Nora had shared them, a subtle but pointed reminder of the marriage Mark had betrayed. Elena walked in, pouring herself a glass of chilled mineral water. "Working late?" she asked, her tone conversational. "Just reviewing some client profiles," Daniel lied easily, flicking the screen to a complex spreadsheet. He didn't look up, prioritizing the illusion of work. Elena leaned against the counter, observing him. There was a pause, a wide, uncomfortable canyon of silence that both of them refused to cross. It was in these shared moments of quiet that Daniel felt the deepest, most agonizing conflict, the urge to simply discard the plan, to throw the iPad into the harbor and demand the truth. But the fear of losing control, of subjecting his life to Elena's mercy, was paralyzing. "Did you remember to send the RSVP for the arts gala?" Elena asked, finally, breaking the silence, her voice too casual. "It's in less than 2 weeks. I need to know the final count for the table." The gala. The target. Daniel kept his eyes on the screen, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. "I did, or confirmed. I'll make sure we arrive on time. It's important to make an entrance, isn't it?" He felt the question hang in the air, a silent challenge. Was she testing him? Did she suspect he knew? He risked a look at her. Elena's expression was unreadable. She simply sipped her water, a glint of the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "It's the only way to be remembered, Daniel," she agreed, a faint hint of something sharp beneath the surface of her politeness. She moved on, presumably to dress for bed, leaving Daniel alone with the digital artifacts of his impending destruction. He didn't know if Elena suspected the truth, but he knew she sensed a change. The slow burn was working, creating a tension so thick it coated every surface in their home. The only thing left was the explosion, a necessary trauma to cleave their past from their future. Daniel looked at the spreadsheet, then back to the photo of Nora Sullivan, his accidental ally. He was playing a dangerous game, trading his moral integrity for a clear exit. And the price was climbing every day. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the Art Institute was a pressurized blend of money, fashion, and ambition. Hundreds of the city's elite, the financiers, the lawyers, the foundation heads, were encased in their finest silks and jewels, each movement a practiced display of influence. This was the pinnacle of the social calendar, a night where reputations were burnished and alliances were silently confirmed. Daniel stood outside the main entrance, his heart beating with the cold, measured rhythm of a clock counting down to midnight. He was flawless in his tuxedo, the picture of a man entirely in control. Beside him, Nora Sullivan was equally immaculate. She wore a midnight blue column dress that radiated quiet, untouchable dignity. Their physical proximity was an act of violence, a silent detonation waiting for the signal. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible above the distant thrum of the orchestra. Nora did not look at him. She was focused on the heavy carved oak doors. "We agreed to this, Daniel. Let's not pretend we have a choice left." The air shifted as a team of ushers opened the doors. The music swelled, a burst of light and conversation spilling out. They stepped forward. The initial reaction inside the ballroom was a ripple of confusion, followed by an immediate, chilling silence that began at the entrance and spread through the crowd like a contagion. Daniel and Elena had been scheduled to arrive together, a joint entry that symbolized their power. Daniel arriving with Nora Sullivan was a deliberate, impossible rupture in the social fabric. Daniel guided Nora to the center of the room, executing the walk with the slow, deliberate pace of a man owning the space. He smiled politely at the first few couples who attempted awkward greetings, his eyes scanning the periphery, searching for his target. He found her near the reserved table, talking animatedly to the foundation's chairman. Elena Hayes was a vision in an avant-garde silver gown, her hair swept up to highlight a neck laced with diamonds. She was performing the high point of her evening, securing a massive donation, unaware that her entire world was currently walking toward her. As the silence reached her table, Elena turned, a look of mild irritation crossing her face. The annoyance of a powerful woman interrupted. Then she saw Daniel, and the woman beside him. The reaction was immediate and profound. Elena didn't faint or cry or shout. She simply froze. The glass of champagne she held stopped mid-air, inches from her lips. Her smile evaporated, leaving her features rigid, a mask of stunning realization and panic. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculated, became vacant, fixed on the unnatural tableau of her husband and her lover's wife. It was not just Elena who froze. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Everyone present knew the silent geometry of the infidelity. The rival architect, the powerful lawyer, the driven real estate agent, and the highly respected foundation head. The pairing of Daniel and Nora did not require explanation. It was a perfect, devastating equation laid bare. The whisper started low, amplified by the vacuum of silence, rolling across the room like a wave. The trade. Daniel felt a brief, cold flicker of triumph, the sharp chemical rush of revenge delivered exactly as planned. But it was quickly replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had destroyed the appearance of his life, but he hadn't regained his soul. He had merely replaced a private misery with a public, irreversible stain. He met Elena's gaze. For a fraction of a second, he saw the raw, genuine pain beneath her panic, the fear of a woman watching her life's careful construction crumble into social dust. It was the first true emotion he had seen from her in months, and it offered him no satisfaction, only a deep sense of shared tragedy. Nora, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement of the mission accomplished. It was at that moment, as the whispers intensified and phones began to discreetly rise around the ballroom, that Mark Sullivan made his entrance. He was late, running his fingers through his hair, his expression flushed with the hustle of an important late-breaking commitment. He walked in, oblivious, until he was halfway across the threshold. He saw the crowd clustered and silent. He saw his wife, Nora, standing unnaturally close to Daniel Hayes. He saw Elena, pale and motionless, staring. Mark stopped dead, his confidence dissolving instantly into horror. He understood the scene in a brutal flash-fire moment. The tableau was complete. Two betrayed spouses standing together in calculated dignity, and two unfaithful partners separated, exposed, and paralyzed by the social consequence. The symmetry was perfect. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the stench of ruined reputations. The gala, the annual celebration of Chicago's high society, had instantly transformed into a silent, public tribunal. Daniel knew, watching Elena's rigid figure, that the private war was over. The public war had just begun. The silence in the Hayes penthouse was deafening. It was the third morning after the gala, and the apartment had the feel of an abandoned crime scene. The news coverage had been relentless. Gossip columns dissected Elena's frozen expression, social media buzzed with the good trade narrative,
and Daniel's firm had issued a clinical, reputation-saving statement citing irreconcilable differences. Elena was gone, having packed a few suitcases and retreated to a friend's townhouse, leaving behind a note on the island counter that was sharp and utterly devoid of self-pity. "You were cruel, Daniel, but never boring. We'll talk through the lawyers." She had refused to give him the emotional satisfaction of a confrontation. Daniel sat alone in the vast living room, staring out at the cityscape that had witnessed his public performance. The initial rush of strategic victory had dissolved, replaced by a crushing physical exhaustion. He felt detached, a man watching the consequences of his own calculated choices unfold from a great distance. He had control, but he had no peace. He tried to focus on his work, but the spreadsheets were meaningless. His entire life felt like a massive, unnecessary excavation. The only person who understood the strange, sterile climate of his mind was Nora Sullivan. They met that afternoon in a windowless private meeting room at Daniel's law firm, a space designed for absolute confidentiality. Nora looked pale but composed, wearing the same professional armor she always did, though the edges seemed frayed. "Mark is staying at the Langham. He called me a monster. He said I was as calculated and cold as you are." "He's deflecting," Daniel said, pouring her a glass of water. "He's trying to externalize the shame." "Or maybe he's right," Nora countered, her eyes meeting his. "I enjoyed watching him squirm, Daniel. I enjoyed the silence in that ballroom. That frightens me more than the affair ever did." Daniel felt a jolt of recognition. They weren't just co-conspirators, they were emotional witnesses to each other's darkest impulses. "The enjoyment is just control," Daniel argued, trying to rationalize his own feelings. "We refuse to be the victims defined by pity. We reclaim the narrative. It's strategic, not personal." "Everything is personal, Daniel," Nora whispered, the exhaustion finally breaking through her professional facade. "We destroyed 2 families in a 20-minute walk across a ballroom floor. That's personal." They spent the next hour reviewing the legal steps, separation, asset division, and the quiet, coordinated press release that would formalize their respective divorces while protecting the image of Nora's foundation. The conversation was hyper-efficient, yet interspersed with long, uncomfortable silences where the weight of their actions lay bare. During one such pause, Daniel found himself speaking not as a lawyer, but as a man entirely untethered. "I don't know how to do this alone. I haven't been alone since college. I look at Ethan and I feel nothing but the panic that I've hurt him more than I've helped him. The silence is terrifying." Nora reached across the mahogany table and placed her hand over his. It was a gesture entirely outside the bounds of their transactional agreement. Warm, spontaneous, and utterly human. "We are both terrified," Nora admitted. "We've used cold logic to manage hot grief. We understand each other's calculus. That's a form of connection, Daniel. Maybe the only honest one we've had in years." The touch lasted only a second, but it changed the atmosphere in the room. It was not romantic or sexual, but it was profoundly intimate. They had bonded over shared trauma and a shared crime against social norms. For 2 people whose lives were built on emotional isolation and strategic distance, this fragile, bitter bond felt dangerously potent. Daniel retracted his hand first, sensing the boundary they were about to cross, the line between co-conspirators and codependents. "We need to stick to the exit strategy, Nora," he said, his voice firm, reasserting the lawyer. "Our agreement was clear. A clean break, mutually assured destruction, and then separation. We can't build a future on a shared act of vengeance." Nora nodded, pulling her hand back and smoothing the sleeve of her suit. The moment was gone, replaced by the sterile professionalism they both preferred. "I agree. We both have children who deserve a stable future, not a step-parenting arrangement built on the ashes of 2 affairs. Thank you for the meeting. Send the final draft of the foundation statement to my counsel." She stood, gathering her papers with renewed composure. Daniel watched her leave. the echo of her touch lingering on his skin. He had orchestrated the downfall of 2 marriages to secure his own future, only to find that the most unexpected and potentially destabilizing connection he had formed was the woman he had recruited to help him do it. The price of the good trade was not just the public scandal, but the sudden, complicated loneliness of surviving the wreckage together.
The Cook County Family Court was a place where human failure was cataloged and dissected under unforgiving fluorescent lights. For Daniel, who spent his professional life controlling every variable, the courtroom felt chaotic and deeply hostile. His divorce from Elena had progressed from public spectacle to venomous legal action, pivoting entirely on the custody of their 5-year-old son, Ethan. Elena's lawyer, a formidable woman named Miss Davies, with a reputation for merciless cross-examination, did not waste time with pleasantries. She tore into Daniel's character with a precision that was terrifyingly accurate. "Mr. Hayes," Miss Davies began, her voice ringing with professional contempt, "is it true that you orchestrated a deliberate, public confrontation at a major charity event, the Chicago Arts Gala, to expose your wife's infidelity?" Daniel, seated beside his own counsel, maintained his composure. "I confirmed my wife's infidelity and chose a moment to formally acknowledge the end of our marriage." "Acknowledge?" Miss Davies scoffed, walking closer to the jury box where the judge sat, observing impassively. "You didn't acknowledge it, Mr. Hayes. You staged a takedown. You arrived with the wife of your rival, the very man your wife was having an affair with, in a calculated act of public humiliation. Isn't that correct?" "I partnered with another wronged spouse to manage a crisis of reputation and to ensure the most equitable, least emotionally messy dissolution for all parties involved," Daniel countered, his training kicking in, using corporate jargon to sanitize the cruelty. "Least emotionally messy?" Miss Davies paused, letting the silence hang. "Let's talk about the emotional mess you created for your son, Ethan. You stated your actions were for stability. Yet the week after your public stunt, Ethan, a 5-year-old, experienced severe anxiety, manifested by night terrors and refusal to leave his school classroom. The school psychologist noted, and I quote, "The child is struggling with the sudden, catastrophic shift in his parents' dynamic, fueled by high-profile public knowledge." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. This was the moment of reckoning he had strategically ignored. He had shielded himself from the moral cost by claiming the high ground of stability. Now that argument was being systematically dismantled by the one thing he couldn't negotiate: Ethan's genuine, measurable suffering. "I regret any pain Ethan has experienced," he managed, his voice tightening. "My primary concern remains his long-term welfare, which is why a stable, 2-parent environment, free from the toxicity of a broken marriage, is essential." "And you believe an environment created by a man who treats human relationships like a hostile merger is stable?" "You didn't seek counseling, Mr. Hayes. You sought revenge. You didn't protect Ethan, you protected your reputation and your leverage in a divorce you intended to dominate. Your very actions prove that your self-interest outweighs the emotional needs of your son." The accusation hit Daniel with the force of a physical blow. He looked across the court at Elena, who was watching him with a cold, almost detached resentment. She had committed the sin of passion. He had committed the sin of strategy. In the eyes of the court and the social world they inhabited, one was seen as human frailty, the other as moral pathology. His calculated victory in the ballroom now looked like a catastrophic legal error. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself in the sterile, airless waiting room composing himself before collecting Ethan from school. Nora called, her number flashing discreetly on his screen. "I saw the early court transcripts." Nora's voice was sober. "Davies is good. She's weaponizing the gala. She's making our trade look like a conspiracy against a child." "She is," Daniel confirmed, rubbing the bridge of his nose.
And the worst part is, she's right. I didn't calculate the collateral damage to Ethan. We made a choice, Daniel. We chose control over compassion. You need to acknowledge that cost in court, not for them, but for the judge and for yourself. Her advice was sharp, clear, and cut straight to the core of his dilemma. His entire defense had been built on the premise that his actions were rational and superior to Elena's impulsive infidelity. But the judge didn't care about professional advantage. She cared about emotional suitability. Daniel hung up, the words moral pathology echoing in his mind. He had won the battle for public shame, but he was rapidly losing the war for his son. The good trade he had orchestrated was proving to be the most expensive, self-defeating transaction of his entire life, leaving him bankrupt of both compassion and control. He knew then that the only path forward was to stop fighting the perception of being cruel and start facing the reality of being flawed.
The predictable failure of Mark and Elena's affair was not a relief for Daniel. It was a morbid confirmation of his cynical view of love. Exposed to the harsh light of scandal, their connection, once fueled by stolen moments and forbidden thrill, shriveled under the pressure of media scrutiny and legal bills. Daniel saw them once in public, a month after the custody hearing. It was at a high-end coffee shop in Lincoln Park, where they likely felt hidden amongst the strollers and freelancers. Mark was slumped over a small table, his famous architect's confidence replaced by a haggard resignation. Elena was speaking rapidly, her gestures sharp and frantic. She was no longer the composed luxury agent. She was a woman fighting for air in the aftermath of a gaslighting fire. As Daniel watched from his car across the street, he saw Elena rise abruptly, her face twisted with a mix of fury and disappointment. She threw a handful of change onto the table, a clear, final statement, and walked out without a backward glance, leaving Mark alone in the wreckage. Their affair had been a fragile fantasy, incapable of surviving the brutal reality Daniel had imposed upon it. The fallout forced Daniel to confront his own loneliness. The penthouse felt cavernous, the silence amplified by the absence of Elena's practiced chatter and Ethan's weekend presence. He reached out to the one person who shared his particular brand of isolation, Nora Sullivan. They agreed to meet for a drink, far from the loop, at a quiet bar known only to old money in Lake Forest. Daniel, needing to rationalize his calculated move, decided to pitch their alliance as a beginning. "We survived the worst of it, Nora," Daniel said, swirling the single malt scotch in his glass. "We handled the exposure, protected the assets, and maintained control. We see the world the same way. We have a shared truth. Doesn't that count for something?" Nora looked at him, not with the cold calculation of their previous meetings, but with a weary compassion. "It counts for a successful transaction, Daniel, nothing more. But the intimacy, the understanding we have, is trauma bonding," Nora finished, her voice flat. "We were two people with similar mortgages on the soul. We used each other to hurt our spouses and protect our social standing. That is not the foundation of a marriage, Daniel. It's the definition of a contract." "I'm tired of contracts, Nora," Daniel confessed, the words raw and unexpected. "I orchestrated this to get free of the life Elena created, but maybe the life she ran from was the one I created first. The gilded cage, the expectation of perfection. I drove her to seek something that wasn't a contract." Nora paused, placing her glass down precisely on the coaster. "That's the most honest thing you've said since I met you. You weren't betrayed, Daniel. You were left. Left by a woman who chose human frailty over your emotional sterilization. And you retaliated by proving her right, by acting with surgical cruelty when she needed a divorce attorney, not a public executioner." Her words cut through the last vestiges of his self-justification. The true price of the good trade was not the loss of his wife or his reputation, but the loss of his last defense mechanism. He realized that Elena's infidelity was a symptom, and his perfectionism, his inability to tolerate emotional vulnerability, was the disease that had killed their marriage long before Mark Sullivan entered the picture. "I was hoping we could build something less perfect but more honest," Daniel admitted, the phrase tasting strangely pathetic. "We can't," Nora said, gently but firmly. "I need to rebuild on integrity, not on the ashes of vengeance. You need to learn how to be alone, without a partner, a secretary, or a co-conspirator. You need to find the man who isn't defined by his balance sheet. When you find him, Daniel, you can build something real. Until then, our trade is concluded."
She stood up, her dignity restored, her resolve clear. Daniel watched her walk out, not with the triumphant, strategic gaze of the gala night, but with a desolate understanding that he had lost the one person who saw him clearly, and he had lost her precisely because he had tried to control her too. He was left entirely alone, facing the profound, humbling wreckage of his carefully constructed life.
1 year had passed since the night of the gala. The noise had faded, replaced by the persistent, dull ache of memory. Daniel no longer lived in the penthouse. That monument to controlled ambition had been sold. The proceeds split clinically with Elena, who used her share to buy a small, modern townhouse closer to Ethan's school. Daniel now resided in a spacious, light-filled condo in the North Shore suburbs. It lacked the raw, vertical power of the city skyline, but it had a garden patio and a sense of quietude that felt both foreign and necessary. He had simplified his professional life, stepping back from the high-stakes M&A battles to focus on consulting, a less lucrative but infinitely more controlled existence. The relentless pursuit of more had been replaced by the humble desire for enough. His relationship with Ethan was the primary, difficult focus of his new life. There were no more grand gestures, only consistency, quiet dinners, help with homework, and simple weekend trips away from the social pressures of the city. The damage from the custody battle and the public scandal was not erased, but it was being managed, slowly, with professional help. Elena, now out of the suffocating structure of their marriage, seemed marginally lighter, though the failure of her affair with Mark had left its own mark of cynicism. She and Daniel maintained a relationship that was polite, pragmatic, and entirely devoid of love or malice, a truce signed after years of emotional war. The final, lingering scar was Nora. Daniel met her one rainy Tuesday afternoon at the Lincoln Park Conservatory. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and tropical blossoms, a world away from the stainless steel and marble of their former lives. Their encounter was unplanned, a chance collision that neither of them resisted. Nora looked different. She'd cut her hair short and was dressed casually. The severe tailoring of her foundation uniform was replaced by soft, comfortable layers. She carried a single, worn paperback book. "Daniel," she said, her voice registering a surprise that quickly softened into genuine warmth. "You look less weaponized." He managed a slight smile. "And you look relieved. Is the foundation secure?" "Secure," Nora confirmed. "It took months, but we weathered the storm. Mark is gone. He moved to LA to teach. My divorce is final, clean, no fanfare. I made sure of that." They walked slowly through the warm, damp air of the Palm House, two survivors examining the debris of a shipwreck they had both helped cause. "I owe you an apology, Nora," Daniel said, stopping by a dense thicket of ferns. "I used you. The trade was a manipulation. It gave me the leverage I needed, but it was morally bankrupt, and it nearly cost me Ethan." Nora studied him, her eyes searching for the old, calculating lawyer, finding instead a man bearing the weight of his own admissions. "You don't owe me an apology, Daniel. You owe me an acknowledgement. We were two broken people who made a brutal, logical choice. I accepted your proposal because I was tired of being the silent, dignified victim. The public shame was temporary. The clarity was permanent." She stopped, resting her hand lightly on the damp, rough bark of a ficus. "But the price is that we can never be anything but what we are now. Witnesses. We will always share that night, that betrayal, that quiet calculation. We used the dirtiest way possible to find an honest exit." Daniel understood. Their alliance born of mutual pain was too tainted to become a romance or even a friendship. It was a scar, a definitive marker of the moment they both chose cynicism over hope. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. Nora shook her head gently. "I'm not happy. I'm honest. There's a difference. I'm learning that integrity isn't about avoiding mistakes, but about living with the cost of the mistakes you've made." They stood in silence for a moment longer,
listening to the gentle drip of condensation from the glass ceiling. The emotional current that had once snapped between them, that dangerous mix of strategy and loneliness, was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared acceptance of their permanent separation. Daniel extended his hand, not for a contract or an alliance, but in a final gesture of farewell. "Goodbye, Nora. I wish you honesty." "And I wish you peace, Daniel," she replied, taking his hand briefly. He walked out of the conservatory and into the soft, persistent Chicago rain, leaving Nora behind amongst the ferns and the humid air of enforced growth. Daniel had left the gilded cage, but the scars of the bars remained. He had won the legal battle and lost the romantic war, and in the end, the only thing he had gained was the painful, profound freedom of knowing the true human cost of every calculated choice. The trade was complete, and the balance was permanent. He was alone, but for the first time in years, he was entirely real.